Hey everyone, welcome to my presentation, Crafting the Wasteland 2.0. My name is Andreas Giesen and I'm working as a VFX Supervisor at RiseFlow Studios. 2 years ago, I stood on this same FMX stage and walked you through our USD pipeline and how we built the Wasteland for the first season of Fallout TV series, which got us even an Emmy nomination. Well, today we are going back in because, Season 2 provided a whole new set of challenges. But before we dive into the shots, let's have a quick look at the latest updates to our USD pipeline and what's been happening at Rise in general. We actually started our first full-scale USD project back in 2020, which means our start-to-end USD pipeline has been in active use for about 6 years now. By this point, our artists have gained a massive amount of experience, but as most of you probably know, USD and especially debugging USD is not always straightforward. So to handle that, we started doing internal masterclasses every few weeks, and it's been a great way to spread the knowledge across the departments and make sure everyone is really getting into syncing in USD. We learned a lot from Season 1 and the other projects, and those lessons led directly to the latest and greatest updates we implemented for this new season. One of those updates was a complete overhaul of how we handle crowds. Now to be clear, crowds weren't a major hero topic for Fallout Season 2. We mostly use them to add a little bit of life and detail to our massive establishing shots. But we still wanted a system that was faster and more natively integrated into Solaris and what we had done before. Another major driver for this development was our studio roadmap. We had several projects upcoming on the horizon with very heavy crowd requirements. So we wanted to use the Shady sand sequence of Fallout as a production-proving testing ground to get the tech ready. So, we just launched our new USD skeleton-based crowd system built by our senior pipeline TD Simon Ola. The big win here is that every agent is a native USD skeleton asset from the start. This gives us massive flexibility. We can seamlessly swap between crowd behavior and hero animation using the exact same asset. We've already stress tested this up to 80,000 agents and it scales perfectly. The workflow lives in SOPs and DOPs for the setup, but everything ends up natively in Solaris and rendering with Karma. And then please don't ask me about the pickheads here. That's a creative choice that only our crowd team can explain. A big step for our pipeline was also bringing the multi-shot workflows to the effects department. We've had principal shots for lighting for a while, but now our effects TDs can also drive entire sequences from a single master scene. So instead of opening 20 files, you just submit once. The system handles all the caching and USD publishing for every shot in that sequence automatically. On a show like Fallout, this is the only way to stay fast. It gets the repetitive work out of the way, so the artist can actually focus on the look. Beyond automation, we also focused on stability with node-based pinning. We all had that late-stage animation update, and it broke everything. Basically, the whole FX sim is not working anymore. To stop that, we can now pin a specific asset version directly within the USD layer. This means an animator can export new versions all day, but it won't touch the effects setup until the artist is actually ready to update. It essentially gives our team a creative bubble where they can work safely without the floor moving underneath them. We also heavily upgraded our quality controls to RiseFlow post-publish actions. Lead artists can now define templates that generate custom QC renders per element. For example, a crowd agent might need a very different QC setup than a building asset. These templates handle that automatically. We even take it one step further by generating automatic slab comps from these QCs, so the moment an artist publishes, they and their lead can see the assets integrated into the shot context without any manual compositing work. To keep our scenes manageable, we also developed the render context switch. It's essentially a logic gate that triggers specific overrides, like light rigs or intensities of lights, only when a particular path is rendered. It allows you to keep everything in one tree without the character path setting, for example, affecting the environment. It's a simple way to keep the scene smart and also the viewport fast. So, with that technical foundation in place, you can see that our Houdini pipeline is constantly evolving. Right now, all of our current shows are already running on Houdini 21, and we're already deep into beta testing for the next version. There are some incredibly exciting features on the horizon, that we are already stress testing in our dev branch. And we are working on even more custom RiseFlow tools to further bridge the gap between departments. I'm sure I will be back here in a year or two maybe to show you how those new features handled the next round of challenges. Speaking of challenges, let's dive now right into Fallout Season 2, and what could be better than watching our showreel. So, let's start.
She stepped, floating on air, and I leapt straight out my chair, almost wept. I swear I must have been dreaming. If I'm sleeping, don't wake me up now. Let me linger and meet her somehow. She glides across the room like a bride, without a groom. If I tried, would she assume I'd been drinking? Too much thinking won't do me no good. The bells are ringing, telling me that I should. Now we fly without a care, say goodbye to the folks down there. Ask me why, or when, or where, I won't answer. I'll romance her till I run out of steam. Ain't it grand, sir? Ain't it all just a dream?
Thank you. So, yeah, in season 1, we were basically establishing the look, and in season 2, yeah, the scale completely exploded. So we had to procedurally destroy entire cities, manage multi-layered sand simulations, and bring the camera really close to our massive hero assets. So, operating with roughly the same core team size, we had to push our procedural workflows to the absolute limits just to survive. We worked on about 244 shots spread across 7 of the 8 episodes, with a heavy focus on episode 1 and 2, which features the massive Area 51 and Shady sand sequences. We spent about 10 months on season 2 with a team of around 50 people. Before we get into the notes and the caches, it's worth mentioning the collaboration on this show. We worked again with the client VFX Supervisor Jay Worth, producer Andrea Knoll, and the showrunners, which was a very smooth process. because we already had that foundation from season 1, we didn't have to spend much time discussing the look. We could dive straight into the technical side of things. They were very focused on keeping everything grounded and tactile, which is why we had such great plates to work with. Having that clear direction early on allowed us to be more decisive with our procedural setups. We knew the goal, so we could focus entirely on the how. Let's start by taking a look at this massive establishing shot here for the city of Shady Sands. In the first season, we already built a part of it for a dream sequence with Lucy, but this time we needed the full city surrounded by destroyed remains of Los Angeles and the Wasteland. To give you a bit of context, Shady Sands was built by survivors after the Great War, and as we learned in season 1, it was eventually destroyed again by another bomb, leaving just Maximus surviving in his fridge. So in season 2, we are jumping back in time to see Shady Sands right before this new bomb goes off. While the intact city of Shady Sands itself was laid out in Maya using a library of different buildings, we used a completely procedural approach in Houdini for the destroyed parts of LA and the surrounding wastelands. Let's have a closer look at how we did this. As a base, we used very simple block buildings matching the actual topography of Los Angeles. It was quite important to the client that the real footprint of LA was still recognizable. That's why the original live action plate here was our starting point, even though, in the end, we kept pretty much just the sky. Once we made sure our LA block buildings were aligned correctly to the plate, they were passed on straight over to our FXTD Kilian Bauer. The first step in Kilian's setup was to clean the geometry and upres those simple blocks. The setup procedurally added interior walls, floors, and windows using Booleans, along with additional rooftop details. Those rooftop details were especially important because from this specific camera angle, the roof makes up most of what you actually see. Next, different destruction settings were applied based on a set of rules. Keeping this whole procedural setup controllable and art directable was absolutely crucial. Depending on the floor level or if it was a roof, the amount and type of destruction varied. We also used several influence objects. For example, buildings closer to the crater are visibly much more destroyed. At a later stage, the client requested that some specific areas have buildings destroyed entirely to the ground. Because the system was so procedurally, we easily implemented this request using painted mask and a few more influence objects. Now, the actual destruction happens inside this huge compile block, which is mostly based on Boolean operations. It is set up as a for each loop per building, which allowed us to send it to the farm as a batch setup. If we tried to compute this locally, it would take a very long time. But by batching it, one farm machine can take care of one building simultaneously, meaning it only takes a few minutes to destroy this entire city. This is what we get back from the farm. It already has some nice details, but when studying our references, it was clear that it still lacked that true messiness of a destroyed city. The holes in the roof in particular looked a bit too clean and simple. So we applied a Voronoi fracture setup strictly around the roof breakups. Adding this more detailed fracture pattern and sun noise instantly made it look way more realistic. As a last step, we generated additional micro details like cables, splintered wood, and twisted metal parts. Those micro details helped to sell the scale immensely. The most heavy destroyed buildings also received big procedural piles of rubble exactly where the roof would have collapsed. All of this combined with a few more scattering passes for details like rusted cars and street lamps, and voila, we have our destroyed version of LA. For the deep background, we were able to reuse the destroyed skyscrapers we built for season 1, arranging them to closely match the actual silhouette of downtown LA. But to really sell the scale and make the city feel alive, or at least like a living ruin, we added a dedicated FX layer to the city. This included several smokestack simulation and various atmospheric effects like drifting dust and localized smog. Even though they are subtle from this distance, having that secondary motion and those atmospheric layers helped tremendously in breaking up the CG silhouettes and giving the whole environment a sense of depth and air. And finally, not to forget the crowd. For this camera distance, they aren't the main focus, but they add a really nice layer of life to the city, especially when you view it in 4K. This was actually the first time we used our brand new USD crowd system, which I just showed in the beginning. For this specific shot, we used it in a very basic way, but we have some projects in production right now that are really leveraging its full power. In SOPs, we can load all agents and animation variants with one node, keeping all the USD attributes to render them after the simulation as a USD skeletons with Karma. For the sim, we just use the SOP crowd tools here, as they make it so fast and easy to set up a basic crowd. But since this talk is not about the new crowd system, let's move on to the next topic. Explosions. After we established Shady Sands as a nice town to live in, the next step obviously was to blow it up. So in comparison to the aerial shot we just looked at, the camera position for the nuke was quite different. This was actually an extra challenge, because the client wanted to show that we are on a hill looking down at the city. Finding the sweet spot between background visibility and selling the height of the hill took quite a few iterations. In the end, we cheated the ground of the foreground hill to slope away a bit faster, just to clear enough of the background to see the scale of the blast. Because of this very different angle, we couldn't just reuse the exact layout from the aerial shot. We had to rearrange the city for this specific frame, so the city center, the cornfields, and the ruins were all readable. For example, the area of the cornfield had to be scaled up significantly just to make it register from this high angle perspective. But enough of layout tricks, let's talk about Pyro. For the actual mushroom cloud, we were able to leverage our setup from season 1, as the showrunners were already happy with that look. However, since it was much larger in frame this time, we used a machine learning-based approach to add detail to the rolling smoke. Our FX supervisor, Christian Rosenbusch, did some deep R&D on the ML Upres options in Houdini. For the rolling smoke, it worked beautifully. We did run into some flickering issues on the mushroom itself, though, likely because it was heavily retimed. So we decided to use the ML Upres only for the rolling smoke. For the shockwaves and secondary effects like flipping cars and reacting vegetation, the first step was getting the timing improved. To iterate as fast as possible, we used a proxy setup with simple geometry to show the client different speed options. When you look at archival nuclear references, that initial shockwave is incredibly fast and has a very specific back and forth vacuum motion. As always, the reference is key. Even so, to get a visually readable result with enough impact, we ended up using a nonlinear shockwave speed. It had to travel a huge distance to reach the camera, so we actually slowed it down as it approached the lens, just so that the audience has a chance to see it. Because the foreground in the plate was static, it was clear we had to replace almost everything. Originally, we hoped to keep the cars from the plate, but in the end, we replaced those as well to properly sell the impact of the wave. Our FXCD, Luca Shipman, set up the shockwave for the background and the foreground vegetation simultaneously. Since the layout was being refined for weeks while FX was already running, we had to keep the setup strictly procedural. The distant shockwave is a combination of volume noises rushing over the geometry and rasterized particles emitted from surfaces to avoid a 2D look and add micro swirls. The foreground, however, is way more complex. It consists of about 10 individual simulation layers, multiple pyro passes for dust, particles and sand debris, and RBD sims for bigger elements like fence posts and sticks. The barn was a simulation on its own, handled by our project FX supervisor Jens Martensen. He added custom constraints and bending to the metal parts so you can really feel the weight of the structure as it breaks apart. Same for the wooden sides in the foreground. Thanks to our USD workflow, it was no issue to work in several different FX scenes for one shot. The lighting artist just gets all those updates pushed into their scene automatically. I want to take a closer look how we handled the plants. Doing a full sim for every blade of grass would be way too heavy. So Luca separated the vegetation into larger and small. For the bushes, we exported the skeletons from SpeedTree and run them through a Vellum hair sim. The sim is extremely fast because it's just lines. We then used a joint deform to apply that motion back to the high-res captured geometry. But I really love how the smaller plants were approached. Instead of a simulation, Luca created a procedural animation setup. We extracted the points used for the instancing, including the orient attribute. But a simple noise wouldn't create that natural rolling wind look. So to get a natural motion, he actually used an ocean spectrum. We transferred the motion and noise patterns from the spectrum to the points and multiplied that with the orient. The entire activation and strength of the effects were driven by procedural mass that defined by the shockwave timing. By using this approach, we were able to keep all those small plans as instances, which made it incredibly efficient for caching and rendering, since they could all share the same memory. All these layers put together in Deep, and our comp lead Yannick Walzer and the rest of the comp department, supervised by Michael Lankes, did a fantastic job bringing it back to the look of the original plate. In total, 2 FX artists worked on this for nearly 2 months. Without the legacy nuke asset from season 1 to start from, it would have taken much longer. Next, let's take a look at the Area 51 reveal sequence. When I first heard about this, I was incredibly excited. It added another major challenge to our list, large-scale sand simulations. What was great about this sequence was also the plate photography. Even without any VFX, the plates looked amazing. This is one of the things I really love about the Fallout production. They try to ground everything in reality by shooting on location wherever possible, rather than just sticking everyone in a green screen studio. It adds a level of grit and realism that is really hard to fake. While this sequence consists of several shots, I want to focus on the 2 most important ones for the reveal. The first moment shows the giant rotors here, which eventually blows the sand away, emerging from underneath the desert. The design of these rotors took some time, but let's look at the FX setup built by our TD Levin Wunder. It's actually a very efficient 3-layer setup. The main layer is the sand falling off the rotors, which is a straightforward particle simulation. The mission is driven by slow-moving noise patterns, and the amount of sand is tied directly to the speed of the rotor's movement. To create a natural wind behavior, we use the pop wind, where the noise and air resistance are controlled by a custom density attribute created with a PC open. By using this control, we ensured that clustered particles are less affected by the wind than isolated ones. It's a simple trick, but it adds so much to the realism of the clumps. To tie everything together and blend the particles with the environment, we added a Pyro simulation based on the particles' velocity and density. For the area where the rotors actually break the ground, we used a simple Vellum grain sim to show the sand being physically pushed and displaced. Honestly, it's a very straightforward setup, and from my experience, those are usually the best. Don't overthink it. By using Houdini's standard tools efficiently, the sim stays fast, and we can react to changes much quicker. And believe me, we had quite a few animation changes before everyone was happy with the swagger of those rotors. A more complex setup was needed for the shots where the Area 51 hangars are revealed. We started with a drone plate of the desert, but because we had to cover the buildings with sand and ensure the dunes reacted properly to the fan-generated wind, we decided to replace the main dunes entirely with CG. In later shots, though, we transitioned back to the plate dunes, so we had to make sure that our CG dunes matched the real topography perfectly. More or less. The dunes were created using Houdini's height field tools, and to shrink them during the reveal, we used the height field erode node. Of course, just watching a height field shrinking isn't very realistic, so we covered the entire process with layers of particles and Pyro. As always with particles and Pyro, the emission is key. To drive the smoke in a way that it feels connected to the reveal, the emission amount was controlled by the difference in the height field between the previous and current frame. We also added a fall-off multiplier near the fans to sell the idea that the fans were actually the source of the wind, and several custom masks taking the wind shadows into account. The client really wanted to feel the enormous power of these fans. So while iterating, we didn't just increase the emission, we added a custom particle sim with a force field near the fans to kick up even more sand and debris. Also, custom layers with sand ripping off in certain areas of the building helped a lot to get the feeling the buildings are really getting revealed. You can see of how many layers the shot is built up, particle wedges, dust layers, and an overall atmo. One of the biggest challenges was blending the Pyro and the particle layers. It took some time to find the perfect P-scale values. You want to feel the individual grain of sand, but you don't want a single grain to look like a tennis ball. So in the end, we used a non-uniform P-scale based on the camera distance to make sure a particle was never larger than 1 pixel on screen. This allowed us to get away with fewer particles in the distance by slightly increasing their P-scale while keeping the close-up grains sharp and fine. Quite late in the game, we also retimed many of the elements as they felt slightly off scale when they were moving too fast. Even with these optimizations, the sequence generated about 20 terabytes of caches. As you can imagine, we weren't exactly popular with the IT department that month. Our complete Yannick Walzer did a great job balancing these massive deep data layers in Nuke to find that sweet spot between hangar visibility and the chaos of the sandstorm. Before we look at the dirigible crash, I want to mention how we use these procedural ideas across the whole show. Even for our hero airship here, the Casvenon, we use Houdini to push the detail. Our CG team, led by CG supervisor Jenny Leupold, built a beautiful model, but to give it that epic scale, we used a scattering system in Houdini to add thousands of tiny bolts, screws, and gravels. If the base model changed, the scattering updated automatically through our RiseFlow dependencies. We also use this for the introduction of Xander. When he flies his vertibird into the hangar, the element that truly ties the CG ship to the plate is the rotor wash. While we customized it for this hero shot, it's actually based on a very robust procedural template we built for Season 1. It just takes the animation and the collision geometry as an input, and the farm gives you first pass in no time. Overall, we are solving more and more of these tasks procedurally. This allows our FX 2Ds to really focus on the high-level look dev rather than just repetitive setup work. But don't worry, they never get bored, as they are still the most experienced power users we have at Rise. Okay, last but not least, let's have a look at this beast of a shot. In the sequence, one of the dirigibles is hit, catches fire, and crashes into the desert behind Area 51. As always, with a massive FX task like this, the first step was to finding proper references to understand the dynamics, the scale, and the momentum. That wasn't exactly easy. There are many air vehicles of this scale in the real world, and there certainly isn't usually a cameraman around when one goes down. So our primary reference ended up being the Hindenburg. Even though that had much more fire than we needed, it was an incredible guide for the scale, specifically the way all those tiny structure details behaved the moment they hit the ground. This shot was a massive team effort. Arnaud Malherbe, a brilliant FXCD we have worked on with several projects, handled the Pyro and the sand simulations under the supervision of Jens Martensen, while Luca Schippmann took care of all the rigid bodies. Again, our USD pipeline was the backbone of the shot. It allowed both TDs to work on the same effect simultaneously and exchange caches in a way that was completely bulletproof. We even utilized work-in-progress USD exports, which meant the RBD work would not be pushed into the final shot USD until the Pyro was also updated and ready to be seen together. Looking at the rigid bodies first. The initial step was preparing this complex dirigible model for effects. Even though we tried to build models with effects readiness in mind, it's still a manual process to divide the asset into parts that make sense for the constraints. As you can see here, every part is cleaned up and treated with Voronoi fracturing. We also added a layer of procedurally generated geometry to the interior. The original model was just a hull, but knowing this thing was going to explode, we needed internal metal structures to fill the void. Creating these structures procedurally, was way more efficient than traditional modeling, and it gave us the messy internal details we needed during the breakup. And of course, running a quick test simulation at this stage is vital to check if the procedural treatment was successful before moving it into the hero simulation. Once the model was prepped, we configured the constraints using different strengths and specific mass to weaken parts where we wanted the hull to fail. While this was happening, we were iterating on the animation to get the hit approved, as that defines the starting point for everything else. The client wanted the ship to stay relatively intact until it hit the dune, at which point we would see the massive sand impact and the primary explosion. To stay ahead of schedule, Luca and Arnaud worked in parallel. Luca ran first passes on the RBD, while Arnaud focused on the sand impacts and the initial fireballs. Eventually, the timing of the explosions actually became the driver for the RBD simulations, rather than the other way around. To get the way the fire propagates through the body approved, we iterated with low-res proxy versions as fast as possible. It took quite a few passes to get the tail section right. In early versions, the back end just stayed in the air, which didn't sell the weight of this ship at all. The key was the timing of weakening and releasing constraints. While some of this is driven automatically by the explosion forces, a lot of manual masking was necessary to make the destruction truly art-directable. As iterating on all these properties takes quite some time, we started with lower resolution versions until the client was happy, and only then we did go for the high-res pass. We then layered on secondary RBDs like cables, small debris to really sense or sell that massive scale. Overall, we have about 12 different FX passes in this shot: dust rays from the sand impact, trailing fire, smoke from flying debris, and secondary impacts where all those pieces hit the ground. The impact on the dune itself is a Vellum grain sim. Finding the balance between the initial crash velocity and the gravity was really essential to make the sand feel heavy. To give the sand enough volume, a secondary Pyro sim is layered on top, driven by the sand velocities. The explosion setup used the Pyro burst and Pyro trails node for sourcing. The real trick wasn't the solver, it was the timing of the internal propagation. We didn't use the collision to shape the fireballs, as that can be really unpredictable with Pyro. Instead, we focused on the shapes and varying initial velocities of the sources themselves. One of the biggest hurdles was the sheer length of this shot. It had 458 frames. So we didn't have the luxury of waiting a week for a simulation to finish. Our goal was always to have a new iteration ready for review overnight. It might sound trivial, but I cannot emphasize enough, use the performance monitor in Houdini. We often find that the bottleneck isn't the simulation itself, but a source that is dependent on a heavy animated object. So using in-between caches can speed up the workflow immensely. Rendering was another challenge due to the frame count. Here we used the Karma Pyro shader and a Pyro bake volume node to keep things efficient and avoid the need for excessive volume bounces when rendering it with Karma. Our complete Kada Bugly did an incredible job balancing these dozen-plus layers in deep to make it all feel like one cohesive event. Just a quick side note to wrap this up. Believe it or not, this was one of the very last shots we delivered back in November. By the final weeks, everyone was already happy with the deliverable crash though. The remaining nodes weren't about the fire or the explosions, they were about a much smaller CG element. If you look closely at the power armor running in the foreground, you're actually looking at replaced shoulder pads. The practical suit on set is amazing, but the pads were jiggling just a bit too much, which made the armor feel lightweight. So while the world is literally ending in the background, we spent our final days carefully tracking shoulder pads to make sure they felt like solid steel. Massive respect though to the stunt performer. Running through the desert in that suit makes him the real hero of this shot, to me at least. So that was the last topic on my list. I hope these insights into our work for Fallout Season 2 were interesting. For more details, you can also check out Art of VFX, and also Digital Production will release another interview these days. A huge thank you to Side Effects for having me again. My entire team at Rise, the show was a blast to work on, and thank you all for listening. Thank you.
So cool. Any questions for Andreas? Yeah.
It's not really a question, but more a compliment. Like I love the idea of deturning a tool to make it do something else. That's stuff that we love to do in FX. So I really love the idea of using the awesome spectrum to drive to trigger the animation of the grass simulation. I mean not simulation actually, but that was super clever to use that way. Anyway, well done. That was awesome.
Thank you. But yeah, I was also very. Luca did an awesome setup. When I prepared this presentation and he explained it all to me, I said, wow, great.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Any questions? Don't be shy. Now's the time. Yeah.
Great presentation. I was wondering, like at Rise, like when you're doing all the trees and stuff. I mean, that's really heavy geo that you're deforming with skeletons, and then when you come into USD, are you rendering like baked out caches, or are you live deforming things with like USD skeleton or?
No, in this case we are rendering like pre-cached elements. I mean, for the crowd it's different, right? There we have to use key skeleton, but no, for the trees it's still heavy caches.
Yeah. Okay.
That's why I think you couldn't also do like a full forest using this technique. I mean, we did it on the loss bus, but there it was just like always the same tree instanced, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, because it gets heavy really quickly.
Yes.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Any other questions? Cool. Very cool, Andreas. Nice work. Thank you.
Thank you.